the hole drilled, and while we're on location, I'm going to go and tap it with this 1/4-18 pipe tap. And a lot of people, after drilling the 7/16, will just throw this tap in there and tap it. And to be honest with you, especially if you're in a tool steel block, that is going to very quickly wear down the tap, because you notice the tap itself is tapered. Well, that 7/16 hole's not tapered. And they do make a tool which is called a taper reamer, and it's for the given size pipe tap. And this is what we're going to use, and it's called a hand reamer. They also make them in power version, but since we're on a manual machine, we're going to use this one. It's got a hole in the back of it, so you can guide your tap handle. And you put some oil on there, and you put a little pressure on the drill press, and we're going to come down and we're going to taper ream that to emulate the taper that there is on that tap. And that way, as we're tapping, we have an equal load as we're going up the flutes of that tap. Now, how far do I tap this? If you take a look at the reamer, it's taper reamed up to a step diameter, and that step diameter is where you stop. You take it to that step diameter. So put a little pressure on the handle and very carefully come down and ream until you're at that step diameter. And then that's tapered the same as what that tap will be. So when you get there, you stop and you pull out your reamer. I'm going to clean out the hole now, and now I'm going to tap. Now, before we actually do the tapping, I need to talk a little bit about that. Again, 1/4-18 pipe tap. But on that block, if you think back to our drawing that we had, the water is going to go in, hit that cross line, and then come back out. And we have what's called Jiffy Tight connectors. You can think of them kind of like garden hose, or excuse me, like the air hose connectors, except for this is for water. And these are quick snap connectors that go on to the Jiffy Tight plugs. So here's a 1/4-18 Jiffy Tight plug. So when you get to the machine, these are in the block, and you push the fitting on there and snap it shut. Okay? So one of the things that I need you to consider when you're designing here too is that this Jiffy Tight has a given diameter, and this size, it's a little less than an inch. So I always leave an inch, because sometimes you have toggle clamps or things that hold your mud set in, and you want to make sure when you lay out your water lines based on your die configuration that you're going to be able to get these Jiffy Tights to snap onto the fittings without interfering with something else that's in the die set. So we have, in this case, we have one hole coming in from the side, which is the cross channel, and that is going to get a plug. And the plug, they make them in different styles, and here's the two different styles. I've got a brass one and a steel one. A lot of people use the steel ones. Personally, I don't like them. I like the brass ones better. They seem to seal better. They also have a little more give to them. So if you want to shove them in there and tighten them up a little bit, you can crank on the wrench and they'll seal better. So they generally seal better than what the steel ones do. And of course, when the die's really old and you're rebuilding it, the brass also drills out a lot quicker than what the steel does. So it's easier to get the plugs out when you're rebuilding a die if they're jammed in. So I'm going to choose to use the brass one. So the question is, we've got a Jiffy Tight with a taper, 1/4-18 taper on it, and we have a pipe plug with 1/4-18. So the big question is here is, how far do I run the tap? How deep do I go with the threads? So I'm going to give you a rule of thumb here. In the case of the plug is going to go in this side, and this goes right up against the rail of the mud set. So if there's another plate or piece of steel that bumps against it, this pipe plug has to be recessed. If it's sticking out, you're not going to be able to assemble the die. So you need to tap those a little bit deeper. And so for these standard plugs, my recommendation is you go about 3/4 of the way up the length of the thread of the standard tap. About 3/4 of the way up. Now, comparatively, these don't get recessed. They're actually going to stick out of the block like this. So if you go 3/4 the thread, you're probably going to bottom out on this 9/16 wrench flat before it seals. So here, I'm going to tell you go no more than 2/3, 1/2 to 2/3 of the way up. Now, the first couple of times you've ever done this, I would recommend that you do your tapping and you follow that 1/2 to 2/3 rule and the 3/4 rule. And then I would actually get a wrench out and get your pipe plugs and your fittings and try them and make sure that this one is recessed and make sure the other ones will go in and seal. And the reason I'm saying that is a lot of times these blocks, after you're done drilling the holes and roughing the cavities and that kind of thing, this goes to heat treatment. So if you didn't tap it deep enough and you send the block out to heat treatment, when it comes back, it's going to be a Rockwell 60, 62, somewhere in there. You're going to be real hard pressed. If that pipe plug is sticking out, you're going to be real hard pressed to go back in there with this tap to make the threads deeper. And I guess there is a salvation for you. It's called a CVD diamond tap. They actually do a chemically vapor deposited, that's what that acronym stands for, on a tap so that you have diamond coating on there, and then you can tap the hardened block. So if you need to go a little deeper. One thing I hate is when these are sticking out a little bit, people will take them up to a belt sander and they'll sand them down a little bit. Well, what happens when you sand it down, you're losing the amount of engagement for your wrench. And so I've run into that a lot on dies where you go to take them apart or fix them and somebody sanded half of the bearing length down, and then you got to end up drilling them out anyways because they're going to twist in the wrench before you can get them out. So I wouldn't recommend modifying the plugs. Make sure you check them. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take the tap, we're going to throw it in a tap handle like we had before. In this case, I'm going to have the same pointer in there that's going to hold it. And so I'm going to put a little pressure here, and then I'm just going to run that tap in, and I'm going to put a little bit of cutting oil, and you should have an air hose over here and cover it with a rag and spray it out. So I'm just going to run down and I'm going to tap that. And again, I'm going to go down about halfway. This is the Jiffy Tights go on this side. So I'm going to back it up a little bit. And I'm not going to use the air hose because school has the air compressor shut down right now. But what you do is cover it with a rag and hit it with air. I backed it up to break the chip. I'm going to put a little more oil on there. And now I'm going to come back down. And again, when I'm tapping these, I'm going to make sure, and now I'm probably aligned enough that I can take both hands on here. Some of these taps, you got to use two hands to actually tap. You know, it's a pretty large tap diameter, and it is tapered, even though we did run a taper reamer in there. But in any event, the idea of breaking that chip and using cutting oil, you want to make sure that that tap stays sharp so that you get nice sharp threads so that they'll seal against the pipe plug or the Jiffy Tight fitting. And I've seen it already, especially like in A2 or D2 blocks. Taps don't last very long in those, especially if you don't taper ream. And what will happen is the tap dulls up, and if you look down in your thread, you'll actually see instead of cutting a thread, you're tearing the thread, and the thread's going to look jagged on that 30-degree edge as well as it comes out to the pitch diameter. It's going to look like it's kind of broken up or jagged like a file almost. That's not a good situation. You have poor threads, you don't have engagement, and it's going to leak. And nobody likes to get a mold set up in a machine and start running parts and then have water leaking all over the place. So we're going to tap down here. We're going to go about halfway up the tap. And if you can't guesstimate halfway up the tap, because it's the first couple times you're doing it, my suggestion would be to blue up the tap or take a black marker, take your scale, measure the length of that tap, and then put some marks on it you know, at that 1/2 inch or 2/3 up the threads kind of thing. And, you know, put a little pencil mark. I know the old carpenter's trick, some people will take a piece of tape, masking tape, and wrap it around at that distance. So if you take a look at this, I've got about 1.25 inches of full threads. So halfway up on that is going to be probably about 5/8, okay, which is what I did. So now that we have that done, I'm going to unlock the machine and move it out of the way. And again, make sure nobody's around when you're moving this thing. Make sure you lock it, because this thing will come back and give you a punch in the head, especially if it's not level. Okay, so now we'd take an air hose and we'd air hose that out. And in this case, I don't have an air hose.
There, we blew it out.
So just assume that I blew it out. I'm wiping it out as much as I can with a rag here. And again, before I send this block out for heat treatment, I'm going to take my Jiffy Tight and I'm going to screw it down in there by, you know, just finger tight. And when I screw it down in there, and I'm turning pretty hard with my fingers, I'm going to make sure I've got threads left. And I want to make sure that I'm at least halfway up the threads on that Jiffy Tight. And if not, I'm going to take the tap and go back in there and run it a little deeper. What you don't want to do is get so close that you're only a thread away and you're going to start bottoming out on this 7/6 or 9/16 wrench flat. If that's the case, it's never going to seal. Also, I wanted to let you know that they make the Jiffy Tights in different lengths, and in some cases we're actually going through the side of a die set on a larger die that might have like 4 or 6 or 8 cavities, and we're going through the window pocket on the cavity, if you will, into the die block. So those die blocks are actually inserts. So in that case, you can get the extension ones, and these come in 3 inches, 6 inches, and I believe 12. And so when you buy them nowadays, they actually come with the Teflon pipe tape wrapped right on them. If you don't have Teflon tape coated ones, when you install these, I'm going to recommend that you take the Teflon tape, and in the case of the plug, you're going to put the plug on the end of the wrench, and you want to go clockwise like the threads are, and you'll notice here now I'm holding it flat with my finger as I'm kind of with my right hand turning, and I'm going to go around there about 2 wraps and then pull it as I tear it. So now you can see that's got the Teflon tape. So if I'm installing them, you always want to put some Teflon tape. Some people don't use Teflon tape. They like to buy a compound that's called Permatex. It's actually a gasket sealer used in the automotive industry, and that's kind of a blackish, greasy looking stuff in a tube, and they'll squirt that on there. Personally, I've used both. I don't like the Permatex though, because it has a tendency of kind of anchoring. It's not quite like Loctite, but it'll kind of anchor them in. So if you have to take them out of there and do something, it's kind of a problem. The other thing is that blackish stuff gets all over you, and it's kind of dirty. So I like to use the Teflon tape personally. Now, before you actually do that, you need to drill all your water lines. And of course, before you send the block out to heat treatment, I would strongly suggest that you get an extension air nozzle and you put a rag over there and you squirt everything out, and make sure that your water pattern, that your holes are to the right depth so that you've established your water pattern. I've seen times where people stop short 100 thou, they didn't break into the other water line channel, so when you throw it into the press and you clamp the water lines on it, you don't have water circulating. So a lot of times if you get an extender, like a brass extender on your air hose, you can slide it in and out like that and blow and clean out those chips and make sure that your air is passing through all of the waterways that you've drilled.